Well, thank you for those songs. We'll be going to Psalm 54. All right, so our summary statement for Psalm 54. Psalm 54 prays to God for deliverance from enemies with assurance of victory. I'll go over that again. Psalm 54 prays to God for deliverance from enemies with assurance of victory. So a brief outline of this psalm would be in two parts, just breaking at the Selah there at verse 3. So verses 1 to 3, plea for help. Verses 4 to 7, confident praise. And I'll go over that again. Verses 1 to 3, plea for help. Verses 4 to 7, confident praise. All right, so we'll move to our observations of Psalm 54. Psalm 54 was written by David. The superscription does ascribe it to him. To the chief musician, Oneganoth, Maskil, a psalm of David, when the Zephims came and said to Saul, doth not David hide himself with us? So it is directed to the chief musician, to the choir master. Neganoth we have encountered on a couple of psalms before, which refers to stringed instruments, sort of as a category, so things like a harp. Does have a musical direction of a Selah at the end of verse number 3, giving a pause there. This is the 7th occurrence of Maskil in the heading of a psalm. And the occasion of this psalm is given in the heading when the men of Ziph betrayed David to Saul, and that is in 1 Samuel chapter 23. So Saul was pursuing David to kill him. David was fleeing from place to place. He came to the men of Keilah, and the Lord revealed to him that the men of Keilah would betray him to Saul, so he fled to the wilderness of Ziph, going a little further south away from the area of Jerusalem or Hebron. Jonathan at that point came out to David to encourage him, telling him that Saul would not kill him and that David would be king. It was because that David was the Lord's anointed, that Saul was not going to prevail over him. But Jonathan also told David that Saul knew this. Saul knew that David was the anointed king, that God was going to make him king, and that's why he was pursuing him so heavily, wanting to kill him. That's verse 17 in 1 Samuel 23. Now the men of Ziph, these are Israelites, residents of Ziph, which is in the south of the land of Judah, south of Jerusalem. They went to Saul. They told him where David was hiding there in verse number 19. And Saul, in turn, blessed them as though they did a good and a righteous thing. He blessed them in the name of the Lord in verse 21. And about that time, a Philistine invasion caused Saul to leave off the pursuit of David, and David escaped and went to En-Gedi, I believe, after that. And that's at the end of 1 Samuel chapter 23. So that was the occasion for this psalm. Psalm 54 is an individual lament, and it does follow the conventions of a lament. In comparison to most laments, it's a pretty short one, but it does meet those conventions. You have a direct address with a petition for deliverance in verses 1 and 2. You have the crisis in verse 3. In verses 4 and 5, you have expression of confidence in God. And in verses 6 and 7, you have the commitment to praise. So these, again, follow the major conventions of the lament type of psalms. Psalm 54 also has some minor wisdom elements. Obviously, we would expect that with Maskil in the heading. But in the psalm itself, we have a contrast in the judgment between the wicked and the righteous and those outcomes. And we also have, particularly in verse 5, we have something of the wisdom reversal of judgment, where their sins are going to come back on them. They're going to be rewarded according to their sins, in essence. We would also say that Psalm 54 has some minor prophetic elements, predictive elements. The expectation of judgment is future, that will vindicate the righteous and destroy the wicked. Psalm 54 also has connections with other psalms, particularly in this David psalm group, and especially with Psalms 52 and 53. So all of these three psalms in particular speak of judgment on enemies, and particularly enemies who oppose God and who disregard Him. And that can be seen in verse 3 here, Psalm 52 and verse 7, Psalm 53 and verse 1. We also have an emphasis here on the name. The prayer in the beginning in verse 1 of this psalm is by thy name. Name reoccurs in verse 6 of this psalm as well, and in Psalm 52 in verse number 9. And we do have the continuing exile theme that is in these David psalms, as well as in the Korahite psalms that precede them. In terms of the poetic features of Psalm 54, it's a pretty straightforward psalm. You have sort of an envelope with reference to God's name in verse 1 and verse 6, so kind of at the beginning and end. Obviously, you're going to have a shift in mood, and this is very common for a lament. So you're going to begin with distress, and you're going to end with praise and thanksgiving. And again, that's very common for a lament. You also have terms of judgment and reward that suggest a courtroom type of imagery. All right, so let's work our way through these verses. Has 7 verses, so I'll go ahead and read those. Save me, O God, by thy name, and judge me by thy strength. Hear my prayer, O God. Give ear to the words of my mouth. For strangers are risen up against me, and oppressors seek after my soul. They have not set God before them, Selah. Behold, God is mine helper. The Lord is with them that uphold my soul. He shall reward evil unto mine enemies. Cut them off in thy truth. I will freely sacrifice unto thee. I will praise thy name, O Lord, for it is good. For he hath delivered me out of all trouble, and mine eye hath seen his desire upon mine enemies. So the psalm opens in verses 1 and 2. This is David's petition. He prays that he be saved, that he be rescued, delivered, first of all, by God's name. And a reference to God's name, and not a particular name, but just to God's name, is a reference that is to his reputation. We've seen references like this in Psalm 7 and verse 17, and Psalm 8 and verse 1 and 9, and Psalm 52 and verse 9 here more recently. And this reference to God's name in this way invokes his covenant promises, because in making promises, God's name is on the line. Like the writer of Hebrews pointed out, that when he could swear by none greater, he swore by his own self. So God has, in essence, sworn by his own name. What he has promised to do and what he has committed himself to do, he has essentially put his own name on the line. His own name is backing that. And so that is a covenantal appeal. And it parallels in the next line, judge me by thy strength. And so name and strength going together here, strength obviously indicating the power of his name. And the call for judgment that is made is a call for vindication. And we've encountered it before, Psalm 7 and verse 11, Psalm 9 verses 7 to 12, and Psalm 24 verses 5 and 6, and others beyond that. So thematically in the Psalms, as we've encountered this vindication theme, it indicates the destruction of the wicked and the vindication of the righteous. So where we see this cry for vindication, this prayer for vindication, it comes with God coming in judgment. So God coming in judgment is going to destroy the enemies or the wicked, and God coming in judgment is going to vindicate the righteous or those who trust in Him, who are in covenant relationship with Him. The call to hear and to give ear, this is a reference that typically comes from the innocent sufferer. And that's something that would also be confirmed by prayer for vindication. So in Psalms like Psalm 4 and verse 1, Psalm 6 and verse 9, Psalm 17 and verse 1, Psalm 39 and verse 12, we have this prayer for God to hear, to give ear to this cry. And again, it typically is indicating the cry of an innocent or a righteous sufferer. Verse number 3 then gives a description of the trouble, that strangers are risen up against me and oppressors are seeking after my soul. So given the occasion of the psalm and also the last line of this particular verse, strangers here obviously refers to Israelites who are estranged from God. So the word can mean a foreigner, and it can also just mean common or profane, and it can also mean estranged. And we find it's actually used that way as being estranged from God in Psalm 58:3 and Psalm 69:8, which are later psalms in this David psalm group. But the last line also confirms that these strangers that have risen up against him are those who are estranged from God. Oppressors that he mentions, the word refers to great power and usually has the idea of some sort of tyrannous exercise of power. So there's great power to afflict the poor and great power to afflict the vulnerable, like in Psalm 37 and verse 35. And he refers to the seeking after his soul. And the seeking after his soul refers to the seeking of his life. In other words, people are trying to kill him. And we've seen this reference in Psalm 35:4, Psalm 38:12, Psalm 40 and 14. And then the last line of this psalm, which again confirms these strangers are estranged from God, though they be of Israel, they disregard God in their unrighteousness. It says they have not set God before them. So think about like Psalm 52:7 and Psalm 53:1, the two psalms prior to this. Of course, Psalm 53:1, the fool has said in his heart, there is no God. Psalm 52:7, lo, this is the man that made not God his strength, but trusted in the abundance of his riches and strengthened himself in his wickedness. So you can see this connection between these three psalms in particular. These enemies are all of a same character in all three of these psalms in particular. And at the heart, there's the idea of betrayal and those that are close or should be close to David that are persecuting him. So they have not set God before them, which indicates that they have a full intent to do violence and that their opposition is to God and to His anointed. He says they've risen up against me and they've not set God before them. Now, verse 4 is right at the very center of this psalm, and it's a central declaration of confidence. And in many ways of looking at it, it is sort of like the turning point of this psalm. Verse 3 gives that crisis. The call for help comes before that. And then verse 4, we have this declaration of confidence. So, God is mine helper, he says, and helper comes from a word that means surround. The word that means to support and to protect. We're told numerous times that God is the helper of the poor and helpless in the Psalms. Psalm 10, verse 14, Psalm 22, verse 11, Psalm 30, verse 10, Psalm 37, verse 40. Now, Yahweh, which is mentioned in this psalm, another name for God that is used along with El, and He's the sustainer of the psalmist, and that's what it means there. That he upholds my soul. He's a sustainer of the psalmist, of his soul, or of his life. But not only of David, obviously, of all those who trust him. And we can see other references like that in Psalm 3 and verse 5, Psalm 37 and verse 17 and 24, and Psalm 51:12. So there is a contrast here between those who seek to take life and those who sustain life, or those who seek to preserve life, and obviously their outcomes. So verse 5 then gives us the anticipation of retribution when God acts in judgment, when he comes in judgment as he has been asked to do. There's a wisdom reversal here in verse number 5, that there's going to be a reward of evil unto the enemies. It's like in Proverbs chapter 24 and verse number 12, referring to how that God rewards a man according to his works, gives him something of the same. We see this echoed in Psalm 7 and verse 16, Psalm 28:4 as well. The reference to cutting them off means to put an end to them. It is language that sort of evokes the idea of disinheritance, dispossession. Truth refers to certainty, to trustworthiness. Another way to think about that could be God's faithfulness. It's God's covenant faithfulness that will reward the enemy's evil and will cut them off so that they are no more. Verses 6 and 7 end this psalm, and here we have a vow of praise. It looks forward to that deliverance, the experience of that deliverance, and the praise and thanksgiving expressed for it. So there's an anticipation of deliverance that leads to a promise of sacrifice and praise. The implication being deliverance from exile and being restored to the tabernacle and the gathered community of the faithful. The sort of free offerings and thanksgiving offerings were more communal type offerings. Trouble here that he refers to, being delivered from all trouble, refers to all manners of distress. And there's a deliverance from trouble and all trouble that is promised for those who trust in God, and that is in numerous psalms prior to this, such as Psalm 9, verse 9, Psalm 10, verse 1, Psalm 20, verse 1, Psalm 22, verse 11, and as recently here as Psalm 50 and verse 15, though also in Psalm 46, 1, which would also be in the Book 2 collection of the Psalms. And the last line of verse number 7 refers to how that he will look on the destruction of his enemies. And that is a statement of complete victory. Imagine maybe a field of battle where the victor stands and surveys the field of all of his fallen foes. And it's an image of complete victory. And what we're seeing actually here and back to Psalm 52, which has a similar idea, we're seeing the emergence of a theme that will come out more later on in the psalm. So in Psalm 52, verses 6 and 7, he said, "The righteous also shall see and fear and shall laugh at him." And then the description given there in verse 7. But this is something that is repeated in Psalm 59 and verse number 10, Psalm 92 and verse number 11, Psalm 112 and verse 8, and Psalm 118 and verse number 7. So we're seeing sort of the emergence of this theme of looking on the enemies in victory, the enemies that God has judged. And this actually echoes the Exodus account. Exodus chapter 14 and verse 13 that reads, "And Moses said unto the people, Fear ye not, stand still, and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will show to you today. For the Egyptians whom you have seen today, you shall see them again no more forever." And then down in verse 30, "Thus the Lord saved Israel that day out of the hand of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians dead upon the sea shore." So echoing that Exodus theme of deliverance and God's salvation and witnessing God's salvation. So in this case, it would be witnessing that vindication that has been prayed for when God comes in judgment, and the righteous are vindicated and the wicked are destroyed. All right, so let's go on to interpretation then. Psalm 54 continues the theme of vindication. I talked about it a little bit earlier in this study. So vindication refers to God's judgment that brings destruction to the wicked and vindication to the righteous, those who put their trust in Him. So vindication means deferring vengeance to God. So that's in Psalms 17, 24, and 35. So there we see that vindication means leaving that vengeance to God. Vindication also means that acceptance with God comes through covenant with Yahweh and not through one's own righteousness. And that comes out in Psalm 26 with this theme of vindication. And also in Psalm 43, we see the theme of vindication, which means that refuge in Yahweh means that there's no need to fear His judgment. So those who have taken refuge in Him can pray this sort of a bold prayer. Imagine maybe, for instance, someone that is on a battlefield and maybe they are, they're pinned down or they're trapped by their enemy and they're taking heavy fire, and they radio in and they call for a bombing of their location. And so it would be like this sort of a prayer that's calling for God to rise up and to come to the world in judgment. But the point is, for those that put their trust in God, they are sheltered in His refuge, protected under His wings, and have no need fear of the judgment of God. It will destroy the wicked, and the righteous will be vindicated. Psalm 54 also clarifies for us the identity of enemies. Enemies are opposed to God and to His anointed. And that comes out in a place like verse number 3. These are not enemies that are destined for God's judgment and being cut off just because they didn't like David, or just because they might have been a nuisance to him, or perhaps there was a personality clash and conflict with them. That's not the reason that they are enemies and that they are destined for judgment. The reason they are enemies and destined for judgment is because they oppose God and they oppose His anointed. Well, that brings us to the messianic hope of this psalm. The messianic hope comes through especially clearly when we do consider the setting for the psalm. So in 1 Samuel 23, in verse 17, Jonathan comes to David and telling David that he would reign. He's the anointed king. He's going to reign. That Saul knows this. That's why Saul is pursuing David to kill him. So clearly, the enemies are raging and plotting against God and His anointed in a foreshadowing of Psalm 2. But these enemies are particularly of Israel. They're of David's own people. Particularly, the men of Keilah and Ziph. They were men of David's own tribe, the tribe of Judah. So David is in exile, and he is rejected of his own, and this is obviously foreshadowing his greater son who was to come. Isaiah chapter 53, one of those places that prophesies just such rejection. And we see that being fulfilled, particularly in Christ's first coming. John chapter 1 and verse number 11, that He came unto His own, and His own received Him not. So David is assured of victory because of God's covenant promises. It's not that David is going to have the best fighting men. It's not that David is going to have the best battle strategy. It's not any of those things. It's because of God's covenant promises. That's why David is staying in the land. That's why he's continuing to move about, essentially fleeing from Saul. He wouldn't stretch his hand out against Saul, who was still yet at that time God's anointed king. So what we see from a psalm like this is that deliverance must come in order for that exile to be ended. It's not that David is going to take sword in hand and go, man to man against Saul and take the throne from him. No, David's exile will be ended when deliverance comes from God. And David's focus is to be faithful. Now, he is echoing here the expectation of the deliverer, the redeemer, to come out of Zion that we saw in chapter 53 and verse number 6, just the psalm before this. So finally, the congregation, particularly of Jacob, that will be gathered by the Messiah in his kingdom are the congregation of the vindicated. And we can see that in Psalm 26 and verse 24. All right, so we'll go to our application. I have two applications, ways that this psalm speaks to us today. So number one, understanding Psalm 54 helps us understand the need to put our trust in the righteousness of Jesus Christ for vindication. And this is why Paul said that none can charge or condemn any of God's elect in Romans chapter 8, verses 33 and 34, because it is God who justifies, and it is Christ who died for that, to secure that justification. So a psalm like this helps to reinforce to us that need, that we need to put our trust in the righteousness of Jesus Christ for vindication. Number two, understanding Psalm 54 also helps us understand who our true enemies are. Once again, someone is not our enemies in the sense of psalms like this just because maybe we find them annoying or they're in some way making something difficult for us. Enemies are those who are opposed to God, who are opposed to Jesus Christ, who are opposed to his will and opposed to his people. So we have a better understanding of who true enemies are. All right. And that's all for Psalm 54. Any questions or anything on that? All right. Well, if not, we will have a word of prayer, and we'll have a short business meeting. Almighty Father in heaven, Lord, thank you so much for this day that you've given to us. And Father, we just thank you for your word, and just pray that you would help us, that we would understand it clearly. Lord, that you would help us to live faithfully, even as we are beset by enemies all around us in the world today, those who are opposed to you and your word and your will, opposed to your Son. Father, I just pray you help us to be faithful, help us to contend for the faith once for all delivered to the saints. Father, I do pray that you would be with us later as we go to our homes and throughout the rest of this week, and those that we have requested prayer for. Pray all these things tonight in the holy and precious name of Jesus Christ. Amen.